Absolutely. And in terms of all of these webinars that we're doing, we'll give you a QR code later to join a WhatsApp group so that you can watch back the webinars, and we'll be running these week by week. So as Shivam was saying, our whole purpose here is to answer your questions, and it's to go through some of the general tips and techniques for the Ucat. So today we will be starting off really broadly. So if you've not heard anything about the Ucat before and you're looking at this question, what do you know about the Ucat, and you're thinking nothing at all, that's absolutely fine, because we'll be going from scratch as well. So I think we've got just under 200 people here, which is really exciting. So if we just start maybe chatting through some of the answers we've got on the screen, again, just as a bit of an introduction to today. So Shivam, this question was really broad, saying, what do you know about the Ucat? And obviously we've got different answers coming in here. Where would we start with this? What things are standing out to you, and what can you tell us as a really basic introduction to the Ucat?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is understanding, why do we even sit this Ucat exam? Why do students in sixth form or college sit the Ucat exam? What is the purpose of it? And as you know, there's a few comments here really about actually it's a entrance exam to apply to study medicine, and it's a very important one, isn't it, Ellie? Because at the end of the day, more than 90% of all the medical schools require this Ucat exam. Now, the key part of this, Ellie, is that it's split into 5 different sections, and someone's written it there. So it's verbal reasoning, decision making, quantitative reasoning, abstract reasoning, and SJT. So that's situational judgment test. So 5 different sections that you need to start getting your head around. Again, we'll be covering this today in the talk and just kind of talking about what that all means. Yeah, Ellie, was there anything else that you wanted to add on to that in terms of anything else on the screen?
I mean, I think that's a really good introduction there. I think the key is knowing that this is a medicine admissions test. It's required by nearly every medical school. And as you said there, Shivam, it's split into 5 main sections. That it's good that everyone here is starting early. We're only in March, so you can start getting your head around things. And we will be going through the timeline later about when you actually sit this exam. But I think that is the gist of what everyone has been saying so far. I'm aware we've had a lot more people join since we introduced ourselves, and now we're a couple of minutes in, Shivam. If we just do a little mini introduction again, so sorry to everyone who's already heard this. So my name is Ellie. We've got Shivam here as well. We're presenting today on behalf of Medic Mind, just going through a basic introduction to the Ucat. And for anyone who hasn't already, if you go to menti.com and fill in the code at the top of the screen, which is 58590662, you can join in today and partake in the questions. Okay. Shall we move on, Shivam?
Yeah, let's do that.
Now, Shivam, I'm aware you've put this picture into our presentation today. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what this picture represents?
Yeah, of course. I think, to be honest, this is a really good metaphor of what applying to medicine really is about. Applying to medicine is very challenging in the sense that there really is hurdle after hurdle after hurdle. There's different stages that you need to cross, and it is challenging. It is very, very challenging. So we go through different things, like Ellie, like the Ucat exam that we sit. You then have to sit the BMAT exam if you want to apply to BMAT universities. You need to write your personal statement. You then can go on and sit the interview as well. So as you can imagine, it's just hurdle after hurdle. But at the end of it, the real last hurdle, Ellie, is really just getting your A-level results and getting the results that you need. And that kind of sums it all up. But yeah, I really like this picture, just so that you can actually visualize this is what applying to medicine is like. You know, it isn't a one-way kind of road. That's very, very easy. It is challenging, but once you get past that final hurdle, you're in medical school, and then it is kind of worth it then in the end. So
absolutely. I'd imagine a lot of people here today, obviously I don't know all of your backgrounds, but I'd imagine a lot of you are coming up towards the summer thinking about the Ucat. So you've already started doing A-levels, already started just at the beginning looking at universities, and this probably feels like a really long way off, this next year, getting through all of those hurdles Shivam was mentioning. But really just starting, getting your head around things, taking it step by step. And as Shivam said, the end goal of this is to be in medical school. And we really hope that webinars like this and actually taking part in different activities will help you get one step closer to medical school. Okay. So we're going to do another nice open question now, which is what questions do you have about the Ucat? So bearing in mind in this session, we will go through things like the timeline. In the coming weeks, we'll talk about different sections. We're going to do a couple of practice questions today. But just at the start, it'd be good to know what questions everyone here is asking about the Ucat. And this is a really nice starting one, actually, how to revise for it. So Shivam, could you get us started with some suggestions about how people can revise for the Ucat?
Yeah, so to be honest, Ellie, I just want to get rid of the kind of myth that comes up year on year, and that's you don't need to revise for the Ucat exam, and it's something that you can do last minute. If you prepare for any GCSE or A-level exam, you know that that is impossible. Any exam that you ever take in your life, you need to prepare for it. You need to revise for it in that sense. So the whole point of today is actually to understand when should we start revising for the Ucat and how do we go about doing that. So one of the things that we try to do, Ellie, is we try to actually look at questions. So if you go to the Ucat website, you can understand what are the different sections of the Ucat exam, what are the types of questions that you can get. But is there anything else that you wanted to add on to that as well?
Yeah, I think just to expand on what you said, Shivam. So with things like GCSEs and A levels, you'll all be very used to trying to learn knowledge from an exam. So
Yeah.
doing mock papers, looking through mark schemes. The UCAT is slightly different in that you're learning skills more than knowledge. So it's an aptitude test. So it's things like if you're given a maths challenge to do in a very short space of time, how do you start? How do you approach it? So it really is an aptitude test rather than a knowledge test. But as you said, Shivam, there is this really common misconception where people think because it's an aptitude test, I shouldn't revise. That's unfortunately not true. I wish I could tell you that was true and you don't have to revise, but you do need to learn the techniques, because if you don't, it makes it a lot harder to sit this exam. So that's a really important point to start on.
Best of this exam will be the ones who are actually kind of putting in the work, and actually if you stop preparing 6 to 8 weeks before the Ucat exam, which is what we recommend, they're the students who actually perform the best. So it really is about preparation. Starting as early as possible is the main thing here.
Absolutely. And everyone will do that in slightly different ways. So you might be somebody who wants to start now in March and do a couple of hours per week and then pick it up a bit towards the exam. Or you might be someone who goes, I want to focus on my subjects I'm studying at the moment, but when it hits June, then I'm going to spend 8 weeks really intensively focusing on the UCAT. So it's
Yeah.
up to whatever suits you, but starting early is really important. Good. So the next question is, when is best to sit the UCAT? So we will be going through timelines a bit later. Shivam, is there anything you'd like to add on this at the moment?
Yeah, really fantastic question. It really, really is brilliant. The best time to sit the Ucat exam is as early on as possible. So a lot of people are probably aware of this, but when you set the date to sit the Ucat exam, you can actually change that date. So if, for example, you wanted to sit the exam on the 29th of July, for example, but then you wanted to change that later on, you can do that. That's absolutely fine. But the best time to sit it is as early as possible. And actually, statistically, Ellie, those who sit it in the first half of the kind of time period actually perform better than the second half. So, and the reason for that is because people aren't actually delaying sitting the Ucat exam. They're not changing the day constantly. They know that they've got a set date and they've started preparing for it early. So to kind of answer that question bluntly, as early as possible, that's the best thing to do.
Yeah, and I think, again, it is going to depend on the person. It's going to depend on your own style. But I think the key there, Shivam, is having that date to work towards and then actually planning your revision, which is the same with any exam you'll ever sit as well. So that's the same sort of question as we've been answering. What is it like? Actually, I think this is a really important question. What is the UCAT like? What would you say, Shivam, just on your impressions of the exam?
So the Ucat exam, to kind of summarize it, is a very, very time restrictive exam. There's not a lot of time in the exam. It's very, very challenging in the sense that you don't have a lot of time and you need to be very efficient with your, you need to be very, very, very efficient with how you are using your time throughout, the limited time that you have. So we're talking about less than a minute per question that you need to answer. Again, Ellie, a big point that we're going to mention today is that there's no scientific knowledge. There's
Mhm.
absolutely no scientific knowledge that you need to know.
Yep.
So it's a exam that requires no kind of GCSE maths or kind of GCSE sciences. It really is about kind of mental maths that you might that is important to prepare for. But yeah, that kind of sums it up, Ellie, in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think when you start looking at questions, at first people might find it a little bit strange because it is such a different exam. And as you said, Shivam, there's no science in there at all. But it will be something that you get used to over time. But that's a really nice summary. How long is the exam? That's a good question. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure exactly. I know it's on the Ucat website. Do you happen to know, Shivam?
Yeah, so this exam runs for about 2 hours, and
Mhm.
each section there are different kind of time. But basically, the timing is different for the different sections of the exam. Now, roughly, Ellie, it works out at around a minute per question. For certain sections. However, for other sections, we'll realise, Ellie, that it comes down to something like 15 to 30 seconds per question.
Yep.
So things like the abstract reasoning section is extremely time restrictive. And the best way to overcome that, Ellie, is by what? What should you be doing in those really difficult timing sections?
Well, I think one aspect is preparing for it. So when you're doing practice questions, actually doing it under real timed conditions is important. I think identifying which questions you can answer in that time and which ones you have to move on from, which some people will find quite uncomfortable at first, but when you see a really long question, actually flagging it and moving on and coming back if you have time is a good technique. And just learning the tips and tricks, the kinds of things we'll be going through over the next few weeks to try and cut down that time. And we'll go through some of those today as well. Perfect. So we've answered that one already. The best way to prepare, I think we started touching upon that. Um, any resources? So
Mm.
one thing that you've already mentioned, Shivam, you mentioned on the Ucat website, there are actually official Ucat mocks. And I think that that's one thing we shouldn't underestimate is actually doing the official mocks for this is really important.
Yeah.
Um, Try not to use them too early just because you need to make sure you have them for when you need them later on, but getting a good gauge of where you're at. Is there anything else in your mind, Shivam, that's on offer that might be useful?
Yeah, so I think, but this is again something that we'll mention a bit later, is about the resources that we have at MedicMind. So if you just go to the MedicMind website, we have hundreds and hundreds of practice questions that you can start off with. We have lots of different videos on YouTube. So really just check out our YouTube and start going through the different videos that we have about the UCAT and the different sections. But in terms of preparing and content, that is something that is just widely available on our website and on the UCAT
Mhm.
website as well. So just definitely check that out straight after kind of today's webinar and throughout the next few weeks.
Absolutely. And I think things on YouTube, like the MedicMind YouTube channel, there are lots of resources there which just give you tips on how to answer different question types. So if you're getting stuck, if you want some advice on how to approach it, that's a really good starting point as well.
Yeah.
Can you retake the UCAT? Shivam, would you like to answer this one?
Yeah, a really, really good question again. So you can only sit the UCAT exam once every academic year. So say, for example, I took the UCAT exam this year. I didn't do very well, and I didn't think it was good enough. You know, I'd still apply for medicine. I'd still use that score that I got from the UCAT
Yeah.
exam, but I wouldn't be able to retake it in the year. You would have to retake it the next year, the following year. So to answer the question, you can only take it once per year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that is quite intimidating. It does put quite a lot of pressure on this exam. So put your all into it. Make sure you prepare nice and early. If it doesn't go to plan, there are some medical schools where the UCAT is less important. So that's something we can touch upon either later today or in other webinars, thinking about actually how you strategically apply to medical schools. But as Shivam has said, you can't retake it in that particular year. So just do your best and try not to think about retaking it because hopefully nobody would be in the situation where they would want to. So just put your all into it.
Yeah.
So we'll just move on for the time being, just for the sake of time today. So we've got a QR code here. So if you guys all get up your phone cameras, scan the QR code, you can join our WhatsApp group. And this is to get the recordings from these sessions and also more information about things that we've got on offer that might be useful to you. Equally, you can leave that group at any point, so there's no pressure from joining it. But if you're interested in getting access to the recordings, you'll need to join this group. So we'll just leave that up for just a moment.
Yeah, so anyone who's kind of worried about missing sessions in the future, or they don't know when the times of the sessions are, that will all be on that WhatsApp group chat. So that's just giving you a little reminder. You can add it to your calendar then. And some people are really kind of unsure when the webinars are, but that's the whole idea of it. And we'll be going through so much more with respect to the Ucat, with respect to personal statements and the BMAT exam. So really, we'll be covering everything to do with applying to medicine.
Absolutely. I'm just going to make a little comment just because this is our first of our webinars we've been doing. I've seen a couple of people's mics turning on and so on. Please try to keep yourselves muted throughout. And there'll be certain times during the session where we turn off the comments. That's just while we're teaching, just so that it's a bit less disruptive. So if you're not able to comment at certain points, it's just so that we don't disrupt the session. And there'll be other points where the comments are turned back on, just so that you're all in the loop with what's going on there.
Yeah.
Keep moving. So we're going to move on next to the timeline of the application. So Shivam, do you want to start off by talking us through this timeline very broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. So when do we first start? Well, the first thing we start off with, Ellie, is that Ucat exam, isn't it? So we can see there that runs from July all the way to September. So off the top of my head, I believe it's the 29th of July all the way to the 29th of September, or it might be the 20th of July.
Yeah.
So 20th of July to the 29th of September. That's when the Ucat exam runs from. Now, you'll then have to write your personal statement, which is then due on the 15th of October, and that's when you actually submit your UCAS application in general. And yeah, do you want to kind of talk a bit more about what goes on after you submit your personal statement then, Ellie?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, Shivam, so everyone will have sat their UCAT before applying. They'll have written their personal statement. When it comes to the BMAT, you can either sit that before you submit your UCAS application or after. So there's two sittings, September and November. There are pros and cons to both. And I'm aware next week we'll be doing a webinar on the BMAT. So we'll leave that for the time being, but you might do that before or after. But the big thing that comes after submitting your UCAS application is the interviews. So really, once you've submitted, your main focus is going to be preparing for those medical school interviews. So it's going to be finding out, do they do panel interviews? Do they do multiple mini interviews? And looking in more detail at the 4 medical schools that you've chosen to apply to. So your focus will shift slightly at that point. So Shivam, I know, sorry,
Ellie,
go ahead.
Ellie, I just wanted to mention just a bit about the BMAT in comparison to the UCAT, just very briefly. So the BMAT exam is it's a more scientific paper, and only a few universities. So for example, UCL, Imperial, Oxbridge, Leeds, those are kind of the 5 of this kind of 7 or 8 unis that require the BMAT exam. Now, 99% of all medical students will be sitting that UCAT exam. So this is kind of stressing how important the UCAT exam is. Some students who then want to apply to some specific universities, but like the ones that I mentioned, they will also sit the BMAT exam. But some students, Ellie, they don't even sit the BMAT exam, they'll just sit the UCAT exam. And a really, really big point that I want everyone to take away from today is that you get the result from your UCAT exam straight away. So as soon as you finish the exam, you get printed a document, and it tells you the results from each of the sections of the exam that you just sat and your total score. That's really important, Ellie. For what reason? Why is that so significant?
It's so significant because I think your UCAT result is going to influence where you apply ultimately. So there'll be some medical schools where the UCAT has a certain cutoff score. So you need to make sure you know what that cutoff score is, and that might rule in and out certain medical schools that you want to apply to. Or equally, there might be others where, say, the UCAT is worth, say, 70% of your mark when you're applying. So it's really crucial that you get that result as you come out of the UCAT, so that then you can say, okay, I know what my score is. Now I'm going to decide where I'm applying. Is there anything you'd add to that, Shivam?
No, I think that kind of sums it up. As soon as you get that score, you know where you stand. You can then, if you say, for example, you've got a very high UCAT score, you can apply to basically any UCAT university. If you didn't do as well in the UCAT, you then have to start thinking a lot more strategically about which universities you're applying to, because a lot of unis look at this UCAT exam in quite a lot of detail. They'll be quite kind of scrutinizing the score. So yeah, that's why it's really important. You get your result as soon as you finish that exam, and you can sit the exam once a year, just to clarify.
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, so we'll move on from the timeline just for now. So this is just a bit of a broad overview of the Ucat, and we've already started doing this already. So the first question, when is the Ucat? I think we've answered that already, in that it's in the summertime. You can choose when you sit the Ucat. For anyone who's not looked at this before, so you sit the Ucat at a similar kind of place to where you do a driving theory test, for anyone who's done that already. So you'll be booking it at a test centre, and you can go along when you choose. In terms of the sections, Shivam, I know that you started talking about that already. Do you just want to give us a little bit more information about the 5 sections?
Yeah, of course. So there's 5 different sections to the UCAT exam. Number 1 is verbal reasoning. You also have decision making, you have quantitative reasoning, you have abstract reasoning, and then finally situational judgment. So 5 different sections. And again, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail just in a bit. In terms of answering any of these questions here, so when do you start revising? We always recommend starting revising around 6 to 8 weeks before you sit the exam. The earlier the better, really. Even if you start earlier than that, maybe 10 weeks before the exam, that's even better. And in terms of how you start revising, Ellie, that's about really using resources out there. So we will be posting so many different resources to you guys on the WhatsApp group chat. Definitely check our website out after the chat to kind of have a look at the resources that we have there, and check out the YouTube channel, because that just has lots and lots of kind of information about kind of how to tackle different questions as well. So that's maybe a good starting point in terms of how you start revising.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And the final question there, which universities use it? Again, I think we have answered this already, but just to be really clear, the vast, vast majority of UK universities and some universities in other countries as well do use the UCAT exam. So unfortunately, if you're applying for medicine, this really isn't an exam that you can avoid. The BMAT is slightly different. The BMAT isn't used by very many universities. So if you chose not to take the BMAT, that is absolutely fine. But the UCAT you really do need, just to make sure everybody is on the same page with that. So we've started talking this through already. So as Shivam was alluding to earlier, the UCAT bookings will open at the start of the summer, ready for you to take the UCAT test between the end of July and the end of September. So if everyone just makes a brief note of this, or equally when we post the recordings, you can have a look back at this. So you want to make sure you register for the UCAT and book your slot as soon as possible, because once you've booked it, you've got a date to work towards. During that testing period, just bear in mind other things that are going on in your life around that time. So we've already said people who sit the UCAT earlier tend to do better at the exam, partly just because you're aiming to an earlier date, you tend to be really motivated, you're not dragging it out. But equally, a lot of you will be going back to do your A-levels again in September. If you put the UCAT in September, you're slightly splitting your focus there as well. So it's not to say you can't do it in September. And if you feel like you're going to have a really busy summer, it's really difficult, there is the option, but we'd advise do it before September if at all possible.
Hey guys, please, please, please don't neglect your A-levels, don't neglect your mock exams. The whole idea of why, a lot of people ask me, Ellie, they say to me, why on earth did the kind of medical schools decide to have the UCAT exam at this time of the year, like when people have exams, they have mock exams? And the reason for it, Ellie, really to sum it up, is that when you study medicine, you have to kind of juggle lots of things at once. You'll be having different exams, you'll be meeting different patients. So actually, this is the kind of start of understanding how do you balance your time? How do you organize your time effectively? So that kind of gives you an idea of just ensuring that you're balancing your schoolwork and also your preparation for the UCAT. So maybe one afternoon you might do some schoolwork. The next day, that afternoon, maybe you'll spend a bit more time working on the UCAT. So just make sure that you're spreading your time. And I think the key word here is balance. We talk about balance all the time. And just make sure that you're balancing between the UCAT, between your schoolwork, and obviously, other things like exercising as well. So just ensure that the UCAT, you work towards the UCAT, prepare as hard as possible, but don't neglect your schoolwork, especially the kind of key mock exams that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree with you there, Shivam. So then obviously the UCAT will close, you'll get your results. As we said, you get that immediately when you come out of the exam. Those results, you don't have to do anything with them. They're sent directly to your medical schools. So it's very much linked with your UCAS application there. And then from that, hopefully you'll start getting interview offers. Fingers crossed, that's of course the aim coming out of this. Okay, so we're going to go through a few practice questions. So today we're doing, hopefully, as long as we've got time, we'll do 2 questions on situational judgment and 1 on quantitative reasoning. We can't cover all the sections on one day, but we will have other webinars where we come back to different sections as well. So, Shivam, would you be kind enough to read this scenario aloud for us?
Yeah, of course. So Jess is a medical student on placement in the local hospital. Now, she has been asked by one of the senior doctors to assist in an invasive procedure. And since there are very few doctors on the ward available to help, Jess does not feel comfortable with assisting because she's never performed this procedure on a patient or practiced on a model, but she knows the theory quite well. The doctor reassures Jess that she can help him, or as she will be supervised. So to kind of summarize, Jess is a medical student. She's never done a procedure like this or even practiced on a model, but she's being asked to do, but she doesn't feel very confident. Now, Ellie, do you just want to just read out the kind of question here that everyone has to answer?
Yeah, so the question here is how appropriate are each of the responses by Jess? So there'll be a number of responses that you go through. So you'll have one scenario, but you might have multiple questions that follow. So this particular question says, I do not have the skill to perform this procedure, so I do not think it's appropriate for me to carry it out. So then based on that statement, you need to say, is that a very appropriate thing to say? Is it appropriate but not ideal? Is it inappropriate but not awful? Or is it very inappropriate? So actually, it'd be really useful if you could all comment in the chat with what you would answer to this question, acknowledging that probably most of you haven't done any preparation for this at all yet, so it's fine to get it wrong. But would you put A, B, C, or D for this particular question? And if you want to, you can chip in some reasoning as well, and we'll go through and talk through how you would answer this question in the exam.
Yeah, so in the exam, Ellie, you would have to just pick one.
Yeah.
And in terms of marking, Ellie, do you just want to kind of summarize how does the marking work? So if I put one of the answers, can I get kind of half a mark? Can I get a full mark? How does that work?
Yeah, so it's marked slightly differently to some of the other sections. So in most exams that most of you will have ever sat, there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer. But when it comes to situational judgment, we acknowledge that actually you can have reasonable reasoning and get slightly off. So for a question like this, if you would say put B but the answer was A, or put D but the answer was C, you will still get more credit than say putting the answer as A if the answer was D. So it is slightly different to some other exams that you might have sat in the past. So Shivam, based on what people are popping in the chat, can you see which answers are most commonly coming up?
It really is quite a kind of broad range. I think there's a lot of B's. Initially, there were quite a lot of A's, but again, some people thinking C as well. It's an inappropriate thing to do. So, do you just want to just kind of briefly summarize kind of what is the answer here and why is that?
Absolutely. So before I give the answer, I'll start by giving a bit of an explanation here, and hopefully you'll all arrive to the answer at the same time. So as Shivam was saying as he was going through the scenario, this is a medical student who's been asked to assist in a procedure because there aren't doctors available. So the first thing to acknowledge is this person is a medical student. So we need to understand our limits. They're not a doctor. She doesn't feel comfortable in assisting. That's really important here, because if she's not comfortable, then probably something isn't right in this scenario. And she's never practiced it even on a model. So sometimes you might feel a bit uncomfortable as a medical student, say if it's your first time taking blood, but as long as you've done all of the safety assessments beforehand, you've practiced on a model, that would be fine. But the key here is Jess is really quite uncomfortable. So to say, I don't have the skills, so I can't perform it, that in itself sounds quite reasonable. So I'm already edging towards A or B here, because saying that she won't perform it is the correct decision in this scenario. So then whether I'm going for A or B, I'm thinking about, well, actually, how has she put this across? Well, she's given an explanation. She's not just walked out. She said, I don't have the skill, so I don't think it's appropriate. She's not blaming anybody. She's acknowledging that actually it's because of just the fact that she doesn't have the skill at this time. So actually to this question, the answer would be A. It's a very appropriate thing to say. So well done to everyone who said that as their answer. It just takes getting used to this. So don't worry if you got it wrong today. As you go through more and more questions, you'll get more familiar with this.
So Ellie, what two
Hmm.
words would you summarize this question in terms of kind of the answer that you give? I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but what two words would you say the first word begins with P?
I'm on the spot, Shivam. I'm not sure which two words you're referring to. So do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, of course. So the key bit here, Ellie, that I'm really trying to
Yeah.
emphasize is patient safety. So what we're doing here is we're putting the patient first.
Yeah.
Every question that you ever get in the SJT part of the UCAT is all about thinking about, can I keep the patient safe? How do I keep the patient safe? So if Jess actually performed this, she hasn't practiced before. She's going into this very, very blind, and she would, be putting the patient in grave danger potentially if she got something very, very wrong. So what she's doing here is being open and honest, and she's thinking about patient safety. So A is correct. A is the correct answer. So well done, guys, for anyone who put A. And again, if you pick B, you're kind of on the right line.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll just move through to our next scenario then. So our next scenario, it's another situational judgment. So we're going along a very similar thread here. Just to say to the person who's asking to take over my screen, I don't know if you're doing it by accident or not, but it's just stopping me from being able to progress the slides. So just be a bit careful with what you're doing. So we've got the same scenario here. We've got the scenario of Jess and the invasive procedure. And the next response is saying, I would be very happy to help with the procedure. So again, could everyone just comment in the chat? What do you think the answer would be for this one? So it's the same scenario, but it's a different question. And it's saying, I'd be happy to help with this procedure. And Shiv, I'm just keeping an eye on the chat. When you start to get an idea of what answers people are going for, just let me know.
Yeah. So again, quite a big mix, but a lot of D's. A lot of D's keep on coming up. Some C's. But I'd say probably the majority is probably D. I'd say.
Good.
Yeah, I'd probably say D.
Yeah, so to start off, yes, those people are correct. The answer is D. So, Shivam, what about this particular question makes it so inappropriate?
I think the fact that Ellie, she's just being very blunt and just saying that I'd be happy to help in the procedure, and is not even kind of informing others about her experience. She's not informing others about the lack of experience that she has in terms of not even doing this procedure before. And actually, the big part of it here, again, it comes to it again, is patient safety. She is potentially putting a patient in grave danger. So again, that is why it's a very inappropriate thing to do, because um, yes, she's it's good that she's being quite kind of inquisitive and keen to kind of do the procedure, but actually she is not competent. So again, another word
Yeah.
here that I'm talking about is competency. And competency, Ellie, can you just describe it to everyone? What does competency actually mean?
Yeah, so competency is really about understanding your own abilities and understanding what you are and aren't able to do. So we use it in lots of different contexts, but in this particular setting, thinking of a medical student, your competency is what things you are and aren't able to do within the limits of your own ability. So in Jess's case, if she hasn't been taught to do a procedure, she doesn't feel comfortable with it, then it's not within her competency to do so. So yeah, that's really important. So for answering this question, I know there were some people saying C, and it's, well, how do you know whether it's C or D in this question? So the first thing I would say is this something you think is right or wrong? Is the very first thing. And that splits you between A and B or C and D. And most people here got that this wasn't something that was appropriate to do. So then it's, how do you say, is it the but it's not awful, or is it very inappropriate? And one thing that Shivam's mentioned a few times is the idea of patient safety. If you think that this is an unsafe thing to do, you're far more likely to go with D than with C in general. There will be differences depending on questions, and the more questions you do, the more you'll see that. But in general, if you're going against patient safety, it's probably very inappropriate. Just to hazard a guess as to why people were saying C, I think the fact that the statement sounds very nice and saying, I'd be very happy to help, we all like to be helpful. And I think that in itself misleads you a little bit. So just be careful and think about, am I putting somebody at risk with what I'm doing here? And that's how you know the answer is D.
Yeah, so Ellie, I think kind of statistically with this question, actually, the majority of people actually kind of in the exam actually chose C. So a lot of people saw the word happy and they were like, oh, actually,
Yeah.
this seems quite positive. It's a positive thing to do. When actually it's quite the opposite, because she's not actually explaining her inexperience, and actually she's not talking about her competency and the lack of competency that she has in this. So Ellie, do you just want to talk about it one more time? What is competency, and why is it so important?
Yeah, so just again, so competency is understanding the limits of your own ability, understanding what you are and aren't able to do. So in this particular situation, Jess had not been trained and she didn't feel comfortable. So it would have been beyond her competency to do this procedure. And it's because of that, she would have put the patient at risk. And because of that, the answer was D for this question. Okay, so we'll move on slightly from the situational judgment for now. But if anyone's feeling a bit nervous about this section after that, there's lots of resources available. Check out our YouTube, come along to future webinars, and we will do more of this. So the next question we're going to look at is quantitative reasoning, which is a different section of the Ucat. So what I'll actually do is I'll give everyone a chance to read this on their own, because there's a bit of data to have a look at. And we'll just give everyone maybe 60 seconds to have a look and think about how they might start to approach this. So we're not expecting you to get to an answer necessarily, but if you do think you've got to an answer, feel free to pop it in the chat as well. And just while people are doing that, Shivam, I think quantitative reasoning is one of the harder sections of the UCAT, just from my experience. What things do you think make this quite a tricky section?
Well, in there, we've actually got so much data. We've got so
Yeah.
much information. So what I'm going to do, Ellie, is actually just be quiet, because I find it distracting when other people are talking. So I'm just going to give it 30 seconds. I've just started the timer, and we'll just let people just have a go at this question, and yeah, then we'll go through the answer.
Mhm.
And just to clarify, you can actually have a calculator in the exam. Well, you can't have a physical one, but in the UCAT exam, they give you a calculator on the screen that you can use. So yes, you would be able to use a calculator.
Okay, so we've given everyone a bit of time to look at this. If you've not reached an answer, don't worry. In the exam, unfortunately, this is a very time-limited section, but the more you do, the more you'll understand the tips and tricks for getting there more quickly. So Shivam, I've started looking at this question, and it says the table shows the prices of different types of snack bars in a local supermarket. And the question is, which snack has the highest amount of protein in one bar? So straight away there, as I was reading it, initially I didn't look at the table because I wanted to see what the question was asking me, and it's asking me about the protein. So in order to know how to answer this question, there's a few components everyone's going to need to look at. You're going to need to look at the protein per 100 grams, and you're going to need to look at the mass of one bar. Because if you had a very small bar with not very much protein, overall that's going to be less protein. But if you had, say, a large bar with very little protein, that's still going to add up to more protein. So you need to look at both. But Shivam, would you work that out for every single snack on this list?
So yeah, this really comes down to time and the lack of time that you have. So one of the things that a lot of students might do in this question is work out the amount of protein per bar, or per, let's say, 100 grams, for example. That is a good way to go about it. However, it's quite well, you're not using your time very efficiently. A lot of people probably use that technique. But Ellie, what would you do in this question? What would you start doing in terms of eliminating answers?
Exactly. So that's the key there, Shivam. It's, can you eliminate some so that you don't have to work them all out? Because if you can narrow this down to just 2 or 3 snacks that you want to calculate, then you're going to save so much time. You're literally halving or even making it a quarter of the time. So I'd look through and I go, which ones have a very low mass and a very low protein just on inspection? So for example, Crispy Crunch, the protein is 2 and the mass is 44. So both are very low. So straight away, I know that's not going to be the highest protein amount. Similarly, the Flapperjack, it's got a mass of 31 and a protein of 3.5. Again, that's far lower than some of the others. So hopefully what people can see there is I'm going through and I'm just scanning them. And equally, there'll be a couple of others there that you might straight away go, no, you know what? Sorry, my dog's in the background. You might go, yes, I'm going to eliminate that. So then Shivam, from there, we would need to take the ones with the highest mass and the highest protein, and we would need to do some calculations. So has anyone popped their answers in the chat at all for what they put for this question?
So I'm just checking now. I don't know if if people have actually put their answers on there, but I think we haven't got the chat kind of available. But I think some people are putting some kind of direct kind of answers to me. Some people have chosen chalk bar.
Okay.
But yeah, what would you say, Ellie, is kind of the right answer here for this question?
Yeah, so I mean, I've got the answer in front of me, and actually that person is correct. The answer was D, chalk bar. And just looking at why that is, so the protein amount is highest for chalk bar. So that already makes you think this is one of the ones I need to consider. And the mass is reasonably high. I think it's the second highest on that list. So as you're narrowing this down, probably the ones you're going to calculate will be the raisin bite because it's got quite a high mass and a high protein. You might want to calculate the gummy bar potentially, but actually if you compare it to the chalk bar, even just comparing those two visually, you can see it's a bit less. So really you've already narrowed it down to either the raisin bite or the chalk bar. And when you calculate that, you would then come out with the answer. So you would need to calculate something here, but you can calculate just 2 of them rather than calculating all 6 of them. So I know that was quite a whistle-stop tour through that particular method, but it's just the method of inspecting and eliminating. And that's one thing that's really important in quantitative reasoning.
Yeah, so just to kind of emphasize, even if you didn't really understand too much about this question, the key part to it actually is just understanding the concept of not having to answer every single question here. So we didn't need to work out and calculate how much protein there was per gram in this question, because that would be so time consuming. What we're really emphasizing here is that in the Ucat exam, you need to do something called inspecting. You need to inspect the answers available to you, and you need to eliminate answers as well. So 2 things to think about when you go away today and kind of start practicing some questions. Have a go at just inspecting, have a look, have a guesstimate, and that's the best way to kind of go about starting kind of questions instead of wasting your time working out the answer for each one.
Absolutely. And I think it doesn't come very naturally. And I know I've tutored a lot of students with this particular section, and a lot of you will feel intrinsically you want to work out every single one because you want to be certain with your answer. The trouble is this is very different to GCSEs and A levels. You just simply don't have that time. And as you start practicing the Ucat and you see the time limits, you'll start to appreciate what we mean by that. And elimination, it's a technique where it just narrows it down for you and just makes it a lot quicker.
So yeah, Ellie, I just wanted to mention something which is really important about this Ucat exam, and that's the fact that you get graded in quite an unusual way, don't you? So you don't get a percentage, you don't get 90% on the exam, you don't get 60% on the exam. You just want to summarize how is the grading and how does that work? It's a bit weird, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's something we haven't touched upon so far. So actually what you'll get is you'll get an overall score and you'll get a mark per section for the Ucat. So the situational judgment section is a slight aside, and I'll come back to that one. But for the other 4 sections, so that's for verbal reasoning, quantitative, abstract reasoning, and decision making, for each of those, you'll get a mark out of 900. So everybody who sits the exam will get a score between 300 and 900 for each of those sections. So knowing what is a good or bad score, it does vary each year. But say, for example, an average candidate might get, say, between 550 to 600 on each section. But you might do very well in some sections and less well on other sections. So they also give you your overall score. So some medical schools will just want to know your overall score. And actually, I'd say that's probably the majority of them. But there are a few medical schools who also say per section what particular marks they want. So when you come out with your printed result at the end, it will say this is your mark for each section, and then this is your overall mark. So it's good to just get a bit familiar with what that might look like. And I mentioned situational judgment. So situational judgment is slightly different. And Shivam, do you just want to explain that one briefly?
Of course. So far we've talked about four sections where you can score anywhere between 300 and 900. The average score is roughly around 600, 650 maybe is an average score. And the maximum score that you can get is 900 on each section. So that means the total kind of highest mark you could kind of theoretically get is 3,600. And in terms of the average, we're looking at around 600 to 650. Now, the situational judgment is slightly different, and that is you are in band 1, band 2, band 3, and band 4. And all you need to remember from this is if you are in band 4, you will not be accepted into a medical school. And the reason for that is because if you are band 4, you are basically incompetent at understanding anything to do with kind of medical ethics or decision making. So just have a look into that in a bit more detail. Just to clarify, SJT, so the situational judgment, is band 1, band 2, band 3, and band 4. So majority of students will get around band 2. But remember, the SJT, do not underestimate it, because if you score a band 4 in the situational judgment, you cannot be accepted into any medical school. So it plays quite an important part in the Ucat exam.
Yeah, and I think just with that as well, just when you get to the situational judgment section, you can be a bit overwhelmed by everything you've done so far. So taking just that 2 seconds, just breathe before you start, get yourself into the mindset for it. Because as Shivam said, it's slightly distinct and it's important to give it its own time as well, even though you don't get a score in the same way as you do for the other 4 sections. So we're just starting to come towards the end. We will do more of a Q&A at the end as well, because I know we didn't get to that many questions earlier, and particularly as we've talked through a lot of things, you might have more points you want us to go through. But this slide is just a bit about some of the Ucat resources that we've got on offer that are for free. So Shivam, do you just want to talk through each of these?
Yeah, of course. So if you just go to our website, we have a lot of kind of UCAT questions and UCAT practice questions and guidance on our website. So definitely check that out and just start to understand a bit more about the aspects of the UCAT exam. And also, if you want to read a bit more about things, say in the morning, you just want to have a little read about the UCAT, we have a UCAT blog just explaining a bit more about the UCAT exam itself. And then finally, one of the things I would really emphasize is just watching some YouTube videos on our website, just to really understand a bit more about the questions that can come up in the UCAT exam. So these are lots and lots of things that we're kind of giving away for free over the last few months and last few years, just so that everyone can really understand what the UCAT exam is all about. But I would highly recommend everyone just having a look, just really starting to absorb a bit of knowledge and just start to really understand what are these different sections of the UCAT exam, and how do we even go about answering the questions.
Absolutely. And I think because we're only in March at the moment, many of you will just be looking at the UCAT for the first time, either today or over the past few weeks. So just starting to look at things like the odd YouTube video, starting to get a feel for what do the sections look like. That's a really nice place to start, because how can you start going through all of these techniques when you don't even know what the sections look like yet? So it is a good idea just to briefly start looking at some resources like this. Don't worry if you've not had a chance to note that down now. As we said, there is a recording that you'll be able to look at to find these resources, and just check out our website if you are feeling a bit lost. Okay,
Ellie,
so
I've just got
yeah.
a few questions that kind of have come up, and I just want to just briefly go through them. So one of them is that are you allowed pen and paper during the exam? So you are allowed a whiteboard and a whiteboard pen. That's what you're allowed, not pen and paper, but a whiteboard and a whiteboard pen.
Yeah.
And just to clarify, you can't bring in a physical calculator like you would do in a maths exam. The calculator in the UCAT exam is actually on your screen. Now, this is really important, isn't it, Ellie? Because that calculator on your screen is very difficult to use. You need to use your mouse to kind of click the different buttons, click 7,
Yeah.
click 6, and it takes quite a long time, and you don't have enough time in the UCAT exam to be using the calculator on every single question. So that's why if anyone can start really going through and revising the kind of multiple maths, multiplications, mental maths, just ensure that you're keeping your maths up to scratch. That'll be really helpful.
what I just chip into what you're saying there, Shivam. So the online calculator for the Ucat, please don't underestimate it. It's really tricky to use. So if you go on the official Ucat website, you can use the calculator on the screen to practice with. Even if you're not using their resources at the time, you can bring up their calculator to practice with. And there's little tricks to it. So you can actually Google the different tricks, because if you're doing, say, a percentage increase over X number of years, you might do that in a certain way in a normal calculator, but it's a little bit different when you come to the Ucat. So it's important that you learn those techniques early and get used to using them, because it is just really frustrating. It's, for me, I find it one of the most frustrating things about the Ucat is just that calculator.
Yeah, exactly. So just ensure that, just start practicing understanding what the calculator's like. I know in our experience, actually, Ellie, we didn't use the calculator a lot. We used a lot of our mental maths, and that's
Yeah.
generally what a lot of students will do in the UCAT exam, is try to not use the calculator unless you really, really need to. Everything else, you can jot things down on your whiteboard, you can do some mental maths, and that will be a lot more efficient and faster. So just bear that in mind. And that is specifically for the quantitative reasoning section, and it's in the name, quantitative, it's going to be maths related. But there's
Mhm.
another section called decision making, and that sometimes has some maths questions as well. So just bear that in mind and just understand a bit more about the calculator by practicing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Shivam, I'm just looking at the questions that people have been submitting on the Menti as well. So the next question that we were asked is actually, do you pay to sit the Ucat? And I think it's important just to touch upon that. So yes, unfortunately, there is a fee for the Ucat. There is a Ucat bursary that's available. I'm not personally sure of the criteria for that, but I recommend you have a little Google and look at that if you think it's something you might be eligible for. And just make yourselves aware early what that fee is going to be for this year. But yes, unfortunately, there is generally a fee for the Ucat. So the next question, will there be someone watching us doing the Ucat if we do it online? And I think there have been a few questions actually about whether you take this online or at a test centre. Shivam, do you have any particular advice for people who are planning on taking it online at home, or where they should be sitting this exam?
Again, this is something very, very important to consider and think about. So majority of the time, Ellie, every single student in every year has taken this exam in the test center. So in the same test center that you would take your driving theory exam, for example.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people find that the best way to do it, because it's in a new environment. It's in an environment where everything is very much controlled in that sense. So that you're going into this exam and everything is kind of there and set out and ready for you. Now, doing things at home, so you can sit the UCAT exam at home. Again, if you felt a bit more comfortable sitting at home, there are lots of kind of things to bear in mind in terms of accessing other resources, which obviously you wouldn't be allowed to, because they're very, very stringent in terms of how they check things using the online test. But what I would recommend in terms of my personal opinion, Ellie, is probably sitting the exam in person in the test center. Because sometimes
Yeah.
sitting at home, you're really, really risking kind of your Wi-Fi sitting out, going. You're risking other things like being interrupted, and that could lead to kind of you not doing well in the exam, and that could actually being disqualified.
Yeah, so obviously we don't know what the COVID situation is going to be in a few months' time. If you're in a situation where you have to sit it at home because that's just the requirements in your area, then there will probably be a form of online proctoring for the exam. So make sure you're well aware of what you need to do beforehand. Equally, make sure your internet connection is as good as possible. So if, for example, you can have a wired connection rather than wireless, that's usually better, or go as near to your wireless box as you possibly can. Make sure people in your house know that you're doing the exam so that you're less likely to be interrupted. And ultimately, if your connection goes down, there's usually some way of contacting the people who are running the exam to make them aware. But as Shivam has said, if you can sit it at a test centre, you're far better off doing so in general, just because there's more variables being controlled if you're doing it at a test centre. You're a bit more protected if it does go wrong.
Perfect. So Ellie, should we just get to the last question now? I know that we're kind of running out of time there. So yeah, let's answer one last question. And again, any other questions that we haven't answered, we'll be kind of posting some things on the WhatsApp group chat, and also we can answer the questions in the next session as well, for sure.
Yeah, so One of the big questions that's come up a couple of times here is to do with the timing. So is there a time limit overall, or is it per section? And do we get breaks between the sections? Which I think is really important to consider. So Shivam, do you want to just walk us through, maybe not even the exact timings, but roughly how timings work in the UCAT?
Yeah, of course. So for each section, you've got roughly around 20 or 30 minutes per section. Now, in those 20 or 30 minutes, you need to answer all the questions there. And again, all of this information is on the UCAT website. There's no point us kind of telling you everything here because it's just there black and white on the UCAT website in terms of the exact specifics. Um, Now, you don't have any breaks in between all the sections. You finish the section and it takes you on to the next screen and you'll be starting the next section. And this is an exam that you have to sit all at once. The sections are one after another, and it's roughly
Mhm.
around 2 hours. So just bear that in mind. Towards the end of the exam, you can get fatigued. After
Yeah.
1.5 hours, it is very tricky. So again, this is why practicing the mock exams on the UCAT website and on our kind of free resources for a significant period of time will start to kind of build that muscle memory and start to kind of make you realize that actually this is a tough exam and it is going to kind of mentally take a lot out of you. So practicing as early as possible is always best.
Absolutely. I'm aware that there might be some people here who do have sort of special requirements, might have adjustments to the exam. The majority of what we've said here is based on the standard UCAT exam. So if you do have special requirements, just make sure you're aware of what's on offer for you personally. But one thing just to really emphasize there is that the screen fatigue is very real with the UCAT, and using the official mocks and getting used to how long the exam is, because it's not an exam where you can sit back at any point and say if you were doing an exam in school, you might be able to just say take a couple of minutes where you refresh yourself. Unfortunately, you don't really get that in the UCAT. So getting used to being focused for that period of time is something that's really important as well. So we'll start rounding it off there for today. First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone who's come along. We've got over 200 people here, which is absolutely amazing. We are running more webinars. I know there's been various links posted in the chat. We've also got the WhatsApp group to keep you up to date. So please consider coming along for more webinars and finding out a bit more about this. Shivan, was there anything else you wanted to add just to close?
Yeah, so I just want to go through really important parts on today.
Yeah.
Understanding there are 5 different sections in the UCAT exam. That UCAT exam you can sit between the 20th of July and 29th of September. You have a calculator available to you. Um, the exam is very, very time restrictive. You don't have a lot of time, so start practicing now and start looking at the material available to you. Really start to understand that this is very weird. It's a weird and wacky exam. It's very different to any GCSEs, any A levels exams that you've sat. So start preparing as early as possible and realize that actually this is different, but with practice, you'll do absolutely fine. And again, we'll be going through lots and lots of things over the next few weeks. This was a kind of short whistle stop tour. Hopefully we have answered any questions that you've had. But yeah, have a lovely, lovely evening, everyone. And we'll see you very, very soon for sure.
Yeah, take care, everyone. Hopefully, we'll see lots of you back here for future webinars as well.